Howdy folks, I'm doing this video because I had several requests. Basically, if you saw my last video, it was the initial startup of this engine. It's going into a 1967 Clark Cortez. If you saw my last video, you might have picked up I accidentally said Kent Cortez. I do have three Cortezes. My first one was or is a Kent, so that's kind of what has a tendency to roll off my tongue. But anyways, please forgive the mistake there. And what I'm going to be covering today is the modifications and custom parts that were required to get this engine into the I don't know if you want to call this a subframe or sub chassis of the RV. But anyways, let's get started. So let's start off with the, well, let me back up. One of the things that was important to me during this build was to keep as many stock parts as possible so that it would be easy to service while on the road. The second requirement was I did not want to modify the 4-speed manual transaxle. They're hard to come by and hard to get parts for, and so I didn't want to do anything that would compromise it or make it so that I would have to replace parts if I ever went back to the original engine. And then the last thing was, although it'll probably never happen, I didn't want to make so many modifications that it would be impossible to put the original engine back in it. So the modifications to the frame and stuff I tried to keep to a minimum, and they're such that it wouldn't interfere with putting the original engine back in. So anyways, let's get started here. There were some modifications done to the actual frame, and they were all basically for clearance. One of them is right in this area right here. There's a gusset that is a diagonal, and I trimmed that down to clear this exhaust manifold. I don't know if you can see on the other side where it's kind of more intact, but it's my lighting is not real good and I apologize. But anyways, it's this gusset on the other side that was ground down. And then the second modification was there's a tube that runs underneath here. I did flatten that a little bit for a little bit of additional clearance around the starter, and it's this tube right here. And of course my lighting is bad, but I don't know if you can see any of this, but this is pretty tight where the starter is. And anyways, I just tapped that tube a little bit just to give a little extra clearance. It actually wasn't touching, but over time things have a tendency to move and settle a little bit, and I just didn't want it to be an issue in the future. I also cut off the factory mounts for the radiator. They just were going to interfere with what I had going with my new radiator here. So the mounts went right in this area here. And as you can see, I just ended up making a angled bracket using this bolt to hold it in. And of course I did the same thing on the other side. And the factory mounts just would have interfered with this installation, so they're gone. And then the last frame modification that I did was, or actually it was actually the very first, was for the engine mounts. And with this engine in, it's pretty hard to see them. Our best shot is going to be right over here. This is a universal mount from Transdapt, and it just makes for a pretty easy install. You weld the pad, this pad gets welded in wherever you want, and then this side gets bolted to the LS engine. And then there's a puck with a rubber and two shields, a shield on each side to kind of protect the rubber. And the thing to note is the Cortez engine is not in the center of the frame. it is offset several inches to one side, so you end up with a very asymmetrical looking mount. The brackets that I had to build were definitely different from side to side, and maybe I can grab a light here later to show you what that mount looks like, but I think you can see a little bit. So again, I apologize for the lighting, but let's go ahead and talk about some of the other modifications. The factory AC bracket and alternator bracket wouldn't work with the clearance. Basically, the floor is going to be right here. So the factory truck mount puts the alternator higher than that, and the AC bracket would be hitting the frame. So I did buy an aftermarket AC bracket, and I'm going to try to get down in here for you. That put it in a better location, but I still had to do more modifications to it. I slotted the mounts so that I could move it up about 1/4 of an inch, and then the tensioner pulley was also hitting, and so that had to be modified also. Seeing if I can get in here for you guys. That's the tensioner pulley, and hopefully you guys aren't getting dizzy watching this, but that bracket is modified also. It was just too close to the frame right here, and so I did that modification. Of course, if you aren't going to run AC, you don't need any of those parts at all. For those who aren't familiar with LS engines, some of this doesn't make a lot of sense, but basically right here I have, these are steam ports, and because the installation of this engine is relatively flat versus a normal installation where the rear of the engine would be slanted backwards, it's important to utilize all 4 of these steam ports. And there are some these are actually factory 4-corner steam ports, and I just had to bend them a little bit to be able to use this intake manifold, which is an LS1 intake manifold. We'll cover a little bit of this a little bit farther down in the video here. One of the other modifications that had to be done, let's just talk about how we got this engine bolted to this transaxle. As you can see, nice shiny aluminum here. These are one's an adapter and one's a spacer. A little farther in here is a very short bell housing, also sometimes called a flywheel housing. And then everything that's this orangish rust color is the factory transaxle. So what we have here is an adapter to go from SAE 4, which is the Clark pattern, to SAE 3, which is this bell housing, which came from a 1996 or newer medium-duty Chevy or GMC truck gas engine with an Allison transmission behind it. So that basically got me to the Chevy bell housing to an SAE 3. And then this is the spacer. It's a 1-inch spacer, and this is an adapter with a 1-inch offset, and this goes from SAE 3 to SAE 4, and you can kind of see that it's just the same bolt pattern, just one's a little bit bigger than the other. And there are a couple of bolts that don't get used in the adapter. These 2 top ones going into the Allison adapter, for whatever reason they offset those a little bit, probably so you couldn't put the transmission in upside down in the original application. But anyways, the other thing is the input shaft is very long on the Clark transaxle. I could have cut off the end of the input shaft to make it work, but again, I didn't want to modify any parts on the transaxle, so I did drill the crank deeper on the OS motor. about a quarter of an inch deeper. And then the pilot bearing, it just needed the center diameter, the inside diameter just needed to be bored out to 3/4 of an inch. And also a thing to note is it's easier to adapt an LS engine in this application because the LS engines, the end of the crank is, it gives you more room than a traditional small block would. And so that's something that's kind of needed to do this swap. So that's one of the reasons I also picked an LS engine over a traditional small block Chevy. All right, so let's see, what else do we have here? Let's talk about the intake manifold and why it's on backwards. As you can see, the clearance up in this area is fairly tight. I mean, it's not impossible to deal with, but it is fairly tight. The other thing that I wanted to keep is the truck water pump. This outlet works really well with this radiator, and then this is just a factory tensioner. And I would have had to go to a different water pump had I put this intake manifold on frontwards or the normal way as it is in a Camaro or Firebird. So what I did is I was able to flip that around. It did necessitate the need for a elbow on the oil cylinder down here, and this is something you can buy that goes to a pipe threading, and then this is just a sensor that reads like a factory one, but it has a 1/8 inch pipe thread on it instead of the unusual, I think it's 16 millimeter factory LS thread. And then of course I had to get my air intake on. I had a ton of room on this side of the engine because the engine is offset, so that was kind of convenient, made it real easy to bring this around. The shifter does get pretty close, and before I set the shifter back in, I was just planning on coming straight across here and just having an elbow in there. And then I got the shifter in there. I said, well, okay, I'm gonna have to get more creative here. But as you can see, I can shift without it hitting. And anyways, this is an Air Raid brand. It's universal. It comes with several cuts or several bends and pieces. They give you more than enough. I have several pieces left over after doing this, and this is a pretty big long intake. I apologize for switching the video back and forth around like that. Okay, so what we have here is a heat shield to keep the air filter from just soaking a bunch of hot air. And what I did is just, this is the very front. So there's some space here between the frame and the radiator behind the grill. And so that the plan is for that to get kind of a constant supply of cool air. And let's see. This is where I will hook the vacuum to the hydrovac brake system. This is a power steering pump. It's for a remote reservoir. The reason I did that is once this is installed, it's pretty hard to get in this whole general area. There's not a lot of access. A little farther back here, there's the trap doors, if you want to call them, and you can get in there. It's not convenient, but you can get in here. This area is kind of a little tricky. It's not real easy access, and it's hard to get access from the front above the radiator because there's just not very much room. So what I decided to do is go with a remote power steering pump, and that's from a 5th generation Corvette. And I don't know exactly until I get it installed, but I'm predicting that somewhere in this general area is where the reservoir is going to mount. And then I'll run a hose down there, and just that's a cheap reservoir that I got off of eBay. great if it works. If not, I'll guess I'll spend a little extra money and get something a little bit nicer, but hopefully that'll work. And another concern is my oil dipstick. I don't know until I get it in there if I'll be able to access this from the side access hole or if I'll need to do something different for that. Same thing with the oil fill. Until I get it in, not sure if I'll need to build an extension. The factory Cortez has a fill tube that runs from here, goes all the way in front of the radiator, and you fill it from this general area. So I may have to build something in the future. Also, the thermostat housing on this is aftermarket, and it is clockable. So I was able to turn it to a direction that suited this radiator. So let's talk about the radiator now. This is a Champion radiator. The original application is an early 60s Chevy Impala. This one in particular is a 4-row aluminum. I was looking to get as much cooling as possible. I live in the Rocky Mountains, and we've got some long passes here, and vehicles tend to get pretty hot by the time you get to the top of the pass, and this engine's going to be working pretty hard getting that Cortez up to the top. This is just an eBay special. I can't remember the name of the brand, but they say that they fit Champion radiators, and they kind of do. They came with the dual cooling fans. The problem is it wasn't a perfect fit. As you can see, I have some space in between here where it would have hit the radiator right there, but I use that to my advantage when I was building the mounts. I do have rubber in between the mounts here. This is kind of similar to the factory Cortez mount. I did use rubber on this side, and also on my bottom mount I've got rubber in here. That way it isolates the radiator a little bit from vibration, and they last longer when you do that. Okay, so let's see what else is on the list. The slave cylinder. So let's go ahead, and I did modify. There wasn't a place to mount the slave cylinder, so I did make a bracket. This bracket bolts on one bolt onto the flywheel housing, and the other one onto the adapter, one of the adapter bolts. And I don't know if we're going to be able to get in. Yep, there it is. So at the mounts there, and I also raised the location from where it was originally. I have a longer push rod on it now, and the reason I did that is I did want to get it up above the exhaust pipe. The exhaust pipe does run down here. That's a heat shield that I put around the exhaust pipe to isolate some of the heat from the air intake and the slave cylinder. So I'm running a longer push rod than the factory. All right, now I think covered most of the stuff. This is a 160 amp alternator. I did want a high output alternator for this application. Another little modification we have here is I talked earlier about these steam ports, how I had to bend them a little bit to clear this manifold, but this can be hooked up to the either a water pump spacer or the top radiator hose, and just to keep the insulation clean here, I actually drilled and tapped right into the water pump. So that's the suction side of the water pump, so there's always going to be a draw on this hose, so the air isn't going to build up in these corners. It's always going to be drawing through this hose, and that just keeps you from getting hot spots in these LS motors, especially when they're sitting completely flat. Sorry to backtrack on that, but anyways, let's talk about the fuel system. I did mount a high pressure pump on the chassis of the Cortez. I had to drop the tank, add a return line, and that return line and supply line will come into this area right here. This is the regulator. Here we have a fuel pressure gauge that I'll be able to monitor that through the computer system. Down here is the return line, and up here on the fuel rail is the supply line. So I'll have two very short pieces of braided hose, both less than a foot long. This is what I'll be making out of, and I'll also have the fuel filter that will fit in there, so I should be able to service that through the trap door. And then from there, what we have is what's controlling this engine is a Holley Terminator. I went that route, just keep things simple. I've never done an LS swap before, and I have read that you can modify the factory harness and send the computer out and have it reflashed, and it just seemed like kind of a hassle. And so I bought this Terminator system. It comes with the harness. You can see the harness here. It plugs into all the sensors, all the injectors, the coils, and even though my intake manifold is on backwards, I was still able to use the harness without modifying it. It would be a little bit of a cleaner installation if the intake was on the other direction. There wouldn't be this wire running across the top, but that's about the only way I could get everything plugged in. And let me take a look over here. This is the Holley Terminator. It's just basically all you have here is two harness plugs there, and this one is the main power supply. And if you choose not to use the map sensor on the factory intake manifold, you can just send vacuum to this, and it has an internal map sensor. This system is also self-learning, and it also utilizes a wideband O2 sensor. That's the wideband O2 sensor is really what gives it that capability of self-learning, because just gives it the ability to monitor air-fuel ratios well into the rich range, which is where you need to be to build power. So that is the wideband O2 sensor. And let me just think if there's anything else we need to talk about. These are aftermarket fuel rails from Summit. Reasonably affordable, and they fit. And the other thing I've got going here is this is the throttle cable bracket to go to the throttle. That was one of the other reasons that I put this intake manifold on backwards, is the cable, basically the gas pedal's right in about this area, and so I'll only have one gradual bend, and it'll come in here and attach here. Otherwise, if it was the throttle cable was here, I would have had to come back and then make another turn and come all the way over here with it, and would have probably added another foot of length to the cable and an extra bend. So that was one of the main advantages to putting this intake manifold on backwards. Okay, I think I covered everything. Feel free to leave questions in the comments. I do plan on putting together a parts list of everything. Oh, and I did just think of one last thing, which was a fairly major modification, not terribly difficult, but definitely requires some welding skills and fabrication skills. These exhaust manifolds started off as factory truck exhaust manifolds. They look like they're cast iron, but they're actually related to a cast steel. And basically that gives you the ability to cut them, grind on them, weld them. And so what I did is on this side, I cut it right in this area here. I welded in a piece of exhaust pipe, and then I welded the end back on. And because the wall thickness would be so much thinner here compared to the rest of the manifold, I went ahead and, if you can think of, I call it clamshell, but I took the exhaust pipe and I split it in half long ways and then just clamshelled it on both sides. And this is, you can see the weld here. And so then I welded that back on for added strength. And also it makes it kind of look like the manifolds came that way. And let me show you this side. It's a little harder to see this side because I did need that heat shield. This is the driver's side. And I did have someone that said they would like to see where the exhaust comes through the frame. So if I were to do it over again, I would have moved this a little bit farther out on the frame, and that would have given me more room on my slave cylinder, the clutch slave cylinder. And I'm thinking I may have called that a clutch master cylinder earlier, but no, it's a slave cylinder. And then on the other side, and that one's about in the only place that it can be. It is really tight in this area, and I did have to grind a little bit of clearance on the adapter there. Very small amount. Of course, that wouldn't affect the strength or integrity in any way, but I just needed a little bit more room right there. And I think I've covered everything. All right, I'd just like to thank everyone for watching this video. Don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments below. And have a good day.